The desert planet was nothing short of a wasteland. The sun blazed down from the sky, making the air shimmer with heat. As the battle raged on, the ground trembled from the shockwaves of explosions that rocked the battlefield. Smoke filled the air, and the cries of warriors from both sides echoed through the atmosphere. Amidst this chaos stood Seraphina, the rebellious alien king's daughter. She was known for her defiance, a trait that had earned her both respect and fear among her people. But today, it would lead to her downfall. Seraphina had fought hard, leading the charge against the human forces that had dared to land on their planet. However, the battle had turned against her. Her forces were retreating, their morale shattered by an unexpected counterattack. As she looked around at the destruction, a cold realization hit her. She had been betrayed. The very soldiers who had once called her their leader were now turning their backs on her. Her father, the alien king, had issued the command to abandon her. Seraphina had defied him too many times, and now she was paying the price for it. The emperor saw her as a threat to his power. He didn't care that she was his daughter. The moment she became a liability, she was disposable. The betrayal cut deeper than any weapon could. She stood alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the ruins of the once proud alien fleet. The dust from the wreckage swirled around her, making it feel as if the entire world was collapsing. The heat of the sun felt like it was pressing down on her, and her body began to feel the effects of exhaustion. She could feel her strength fading. Her hands shook as she reached for her cloaking device. The device, a piece of advanced technology designed to help her escape dangerous situations, was malfunctioning. The screen flickered, the device refusing to activate. No escape. The thought sent a wave of panic through her. Her eyes darted across the battlefield, hoping for some sign of salvation. But there was none. Her breaths grew shallow as the desert winds kicked up around her, burying her in sand. The storm had arrived, and with it the end seemed near. The harsh winds whipped against her face, stinging her skin as she fell to her knees. Her vision blurred, and she fought to stay conscious. The weight of her betrayal felt unbearable, and she knew this would be her last stand. They left me to die. The thought echoed in her mind as the darkness closed in. As the last of her strength slipped away, a faint sound broke through the deafening silence of the desert storm. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it grew louder. A voice, a human voice. It was distant, almost too far to reach her, but it was unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible? A human here, on this forsaken planet, in the middle of this chaos. Her mind raced, and she mustered the last of her energy to raise her head, her eyes scanning the horizon. Through the haze of the storm, she saw a figure in the distance, a silhouette moving toward her. It was a man, a human. He was coming closer, his movements steady despite the winds. Why would a human come for me? The question buzzed in her mind. Her people had long viewed humans as nothing more than pests. They had underestimated the human race, assuming they were weak and unworthy of respect. But this human, this one was different. Seraphina's thoughts were clouded with confusion. Is he here to kill me? Or is he here to help? Her vision began to fade again, and she knew her time was running out. The last thing she wanted was to die in the desert, abandoned by both her people and her enemies. The wind howled louder, the sand now swirling in a deadly dance around her. She could barely keep her eyes open, but the human was still there, growing closer. Something about him seemed different, determined, resolute. Was he really coming to save her? Her body gave way, and she collapsed onto the sand, the world around her spinning. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, drawing nearer. She could only hope it wasn't too late. Seraphina's senses came back slowly, her mind foggy as she struggled to regain consciousness. The world around her felt strange, cooler, less suffocating. She could feel a soft surface beneath her, but it wasn't the sand she had expected. She opened her eyes just a crack, and her vision was blurry. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through her body, making her wince. Her body was weak, and her muscles ached from the ordeal. A figure hovered over her. The first thing she noticed was the human insignia on his armor, a human soldier. He saved me. The thought hit her like a jolt of electricity. How had he found her in this desolate place, and why? She tried to sit up, but the human gently placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to remain still. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "Take it easy. You're safe for now." Serafina's mind raced. Safe. The word seemed almost foreign to her. No one had ever told her she was safe before, not even her father. She looked at him, studying his features. He was tall, with short brown hair and a face hardened by battle, yet there was a kindness in his eyes. He had risked everything to save her, even though she was his enemy. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice weak but determined. The soldier didn't immediately answer. Instead, he checked her wounds, administering a quick dose of healing serum to help stabilize her condition. He had the skills of a trained medic, and the way he worked with ease showed he had done this many times before. Once he was done, he finally looked up at her. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should be left to die out here, not even someone from the enemy's side." Serafina stared at him in disbelief. The right thing to do. She had never heard of such a thing. Her people lived by power, by survival of the fittest. They didn't believe in mercy, especially not for the weak. And yet, this human was treating her like she was worth saving. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Serafina didn't feel alone. She looked at the human soldier again, trying to understand the kindness in his actions. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more to humanity than she had been taught to believe. But for now, all she could do was rest. She had to heal, to gather her strength, and prepare for whatever came next. The desert had claimed so much from her, she thought. But maybe, just maybe, it had given her a chance at something more, something beyond betrayal and survival. And so, the first chapter of her new life began. Serafina awoke to the soft hum of machinery, her senses slowly returning as the cool air filled her lungs. She blinked against the brightness, her body aching with every movement. She tried to push herself up, but a sharp pain shot through her side, forcing her back down. The desert was still outside, vast and empty, but the sounds of the storm had died down. The human soldier who had saved her was sitting nearby, his attention focused on a small device in his hand. His armor was covered in the dust of battle, but there was a calmness about him. He didn't look like a soldier in the midst of a war, but rather a man who had seen too much and wanted to make sure he could do one thing right. "Take it easy," he said, looking up from his device. "You're safe now." Serafina clenched her fists. Safe. She could hardly believe the word. To be safe was something she had never known in her life. Not among her people who saw power as the only true form of respect, and certainly not in her father's empire, where betrayal and survival were the only rules. She had spent her entire life earning respect through fear and rebellion, but here she was, saved by the very species she had been taught to hate. She looked at the soldier, his rugged face etched with the signs of war, and yet there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He was different from the cold, calculating aliens she had known her entire life. "You saved me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Why?" The soldier paused for a moment before standing and walking over to her. He kneeled down beside her, his eyes soft, but firm. "Because no one should be left to die out here," he replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "It doesn't matter who you are, or what side you're on. You deserve a chance." Serafina felt a bitter laugh rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. A chance? How foolish. Her people didn't believe in chances. They believed in power. They believed in crushing their enemies beneath their heels. But here she was, lying in the dust, the very person who had defied her father's rule, being saved by one of those enemies. "Do you think I'll just forget who I am?" she asked, her tone more defensive than she intended. "I'm not your ally. I'm not one of your friends." The soldier, Jake, seemed unfazed by her anger. He simply nodded, as though he had expected this reaction. He placed a small ration pack by her side and then sat down across from her. "I'm not asking you to be my friend," Jake said, "but we're both stuck here. And the truth is, we need each other to survive." Serafina's eyes narrowed. Survive. She had been trained to fight alone. She had led her people through many battles, always trusting her instincts, always relying on herself. Asking for help was a weakness, a flaw she couldn't afford. But here she was, dependent on this human for survival. "You trust me that much?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You think I'll help you?" Jake chuckled softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know," he said, his tone laced with dry humor. "But we're both stuck in the same mess now. And if we're going to get out of here, we'll need to work together. So, unless you've got a better idea, I suggest we figure it out." Serafina was silent, her thoughts racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. Why would a human care about her? Why would he want to help the daughter of the alien king, someone who had fought against humans her entire life? She had been taught to view them as weak, primitive, and unworthy of anything other than conquest. But Jake, for some reason, was different. There was no malice in his actions, no ulterior motive in his eyes. It was as if he genuinely believed in the idea of helping another being, regardless of the situation. "Fine," she said, finally breaking the silence. "What do you suggest?" Jake smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him since they met. It was small, but it made her feel strange. The weight of her past seemed to lessen just a little. The human soldier wasn't just saving her. He was offering something she hadn't experienced before, a partnership. "We head west," Jake said, pointing toward the horizon. "There's a rebel outpost about 30 clicks from here. They might be able to help us." Serafina glanced out toward the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of sand that seemed to swallow everything in its path. 30 clicks. It felt like an impossible distance, but Jake seemed confident, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure whether to trust her instincts or the calm assurance of this strange human. "How do you know this?" she asked. "How can you be sure there's anyone out there?" Jake stood up, brushing sand off his legs as he secured his weapon. "I've been on missions like this before. And besides, if they don't help us, we'll figure something out." Serafina couldn't believe it. This human soldier, who had no reason to help her, was already planning their next move. She had no idea where to go, no idea who to trust. But here, for the first time, she was starting to realize that maybe she didn't have to do this alone. "All right," she said reluctantly, "but if you try anything, I'll kill you." Jake raised his hands in mock surrender, his smile never faltering. "Deal." The two of them set off toward the rebel outpost, their journey fraught with the dangers of the desert. But despite the harsh conditions, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. They were no longer enemies, at least not in the way they had been before. The animosity between them had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something else, a fragile understanding. As they walked, Jake spoke to her, telling stories of his time on Earth, of his family, and of the human struggle to survive against overwhelming odds. Serafina listened, half out of curiosity, half out of the need to distract herself from the painful reality of their situation. She had never heard of such things before. Her own people had no stories of compassion, of family, or of kindness. Their stories were ones of conquest and power. "Humans are a strange breed," Serafina said after a long silence. Jake laughed. "Yeah, I get that a lot, but we've had to be. Survival's been hard for us, but it's not just about fighting. It's about doing what's right when no one else will." Serafina looked at him, trying to understand his words. Doing what's right. Was that truly the core of humanity's strength? It was hard to believe, but Jake's actions had proven otherwise. He had saved her life without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. She had never known anyone like him. By the time they reached the rebel outpost, the desert had turned cold. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the stars to shine in a clear, unforgiving sky. They had made it. But despite the small victory, Serafina couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the rebels really help them? Or had they been walking into another trap? But Jake didn't seem worried. As they approached the outpost, he turned to her and said, "You know, you're starting to look like a human survivor. Might have to get you a uniform next." Serafina raised an eyebrow, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed. It was a soft sound, a fleeting moment of peace in the chaos that had become her life. The fragile alliance between them was far from perfect, but it was a start. And in the desert, where death lurked around every corner, that was all they had. The rebel outpost stood as a small but resolute fortress in the middle of the desert, surrounded by rugged terrain and harsh winds. Serafina and Jake approached cautiously, their steps leaving faint imprints in the sand. The cold night air stung against their faces, but neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. The journey had been long, filled with moments of silence that were only broken by the sounds of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of the wind. As they neared the gates of the outpost, two armed rebels emerged from the shadows, their eyes scanning them warily. Jake raised his hands in a gesture of peace, but the rebels didn't lower their weapons. They had seen too many strangers come and go, and trust was a luxury they could not afford. "We're not here to fight," Jake said firmly, his voice steady. "We need help. We've been through hell out there." The two rebels exchanged a brief glance, then nodded, gesturing for them to follow. They led Jake and Serafina into the heart of the outpost, where a group of men and women were gathered around a fire, discussing their next move. The walls were lined with makeshift tents, and the scent of food mixed with the sharp scent of metal and gunpowder. The rebels had clearly been here for a while, living off whatever resources they could scavenge from the surrounding desert. A tall, muscular man with a deep scar across his cheek approached them. His eyes were suspicious, but there was something in his gaze that indicated he had seen more than his fair share of battles. He was the leader of the outpost, and his presence demanded attention. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "We don't take kindly to strangers out here, especially ones who have no business with us." Jake stepped forward, his tone respectful but firm. "We're not your enemies. We need shelter, food, and a way out of this hellhole. We've been walking for days." The leader's eyes flicked to Serafina, and his expression shifted from suspicion to interest. He recognized her immediately, her exotic features, her regal posture, and the air of authority that clung to her were unmistakable. She was no ordinary person. The leader, whose name was Roran, had encountered enough alien royalty in his time to know when someone of importance was in his presence. "Who is she?" Roran asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Serafina stiffened, her pride kicking in. She had never been one to reveal her true identity to anyone, especially not humans. They had no right to know who she was or where she came from. But as she met Jake's gaze, she saw the silent encouragement in his eyes. He was trying to make a deal, trying to build trust with these rebels. She could either play along or risk their lives. She's someone who can help you," Jake said, choosing his words carefully. "But right now, we need to focus on surviving." Roran studied Serafina for a moment, then nodded. He seemed to understand that there was more to her than met the eye. "Fine," he said, his tone not completely convinced but accepting nonetheless. "You can stay for the night, but come morning, you're going to have to explain who she really is. You don't just show up with someone like that and expect us to ignore it." Serafina felt a pang of annoyance, but she pushed it down. She had to be careful. She couldn't afford to reveal too much. Her father's enemies were everywhere, and there was a chance that one of these rebels could be an informant. They had already done the impossible, saved her from the desert. But now, they were getting too close to the truth. The rebels gave them food and water, and Jake led Seraphina to a small tent where they could rest for the night. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but Jake didn't press her. He could see the weight of her thoughts, the burden she carried, and he respected her need for space. Seraphina sat down on the ground, her back against the rough fabric of the tent. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. The weight of her position, the expectations of her family, the rebellion against her father, it was all so overwhelming. She had fought for so long to prove herself, to show her strength. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was nothing more than a pawn in a game that was far beyond her control. Jake sat across from her, his eyes steady. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Seraphina looked at him, her expression hard. "There's nothing to talk about," she replied sharply. "I'm just a survivor." Jake didn't push her. He understood that people like Seraphina didn't easily open up. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, allowing her the time she needed. But as the night wore on, Jake couldn't help but wonder about her past. She had hinted at something more, something deeper, but she was keeping it locked away. The next morning, after a long night of rest, Jake and Seraphina were summoned to meet with Roran. As they stepped outside the tent, the cold desert air greeted them, and they made their way to the center of the outpost where the rebels had gathered. Roran was waiting for them, his arms crossed over his chest as he looked at Seraphina expectantly. "Now you're going to tell me who she really is," Roran said, his voice serious. "We don't have time for games. This isn't some casual mission. We're fighting for our lives out here. And if you're hiding something, it'll be our lives at risk." Seraphina hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the rebels on her, and she knew that one wrong move could cost her everything. But there was no choice. They had earned her trust, however fragile it was, and she couldn't risk jeopardizing their safety by keeping secrets any longer. "I am the daughter of King Varkar," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I am a princess of the Lorian Empire." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. The rebels exchanged shocked looks, their faces paling. Roran's expression remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. Seraphina could see the realization in their eyes. They had been harboring royalty, someone from the very empire they had been fighting against. "You're the daughter of Varkar," Roran finally spoke, his voice low. "That's a problem." Seraphina nodded, her heart heavy. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to survive. But my people betrayed me. I need your help to escape." Roran looked at her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Finally, he spoke. "All right," he said. "You'll stay. But don't think for a second that you're not being watched. If you are lying, if you're hiding something, we'll deal with it." Seraphina met his gaze, the weight of her secret hanging heavily between them. For now, she had no choice but to trust them. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the revelation of her identity had changed everything. She had wanted to escape her past, to leave her father's empire behind. But now, it seemed that her past was catching up with her faster than she could run. As the rebels led them further into the outpost, Seraphina couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake by revealing her true identity. But it was too late now. There was no turning back. The desert sun beat down relentlessly on the small rebel outpost as the morning wore on. The cold desert night had given way to the scorching heat of the day, and the rebels, who had been used to this harsh environment, moved slowly and carefully under the oppressive sunlight. Seraphina stood near a makeshift wall, her gaze far off, lost in the distance. The winds howled through the open spaces, carrying with them whispers of danger. She could feel it in her bones. The past was closing in on her. Her father, King Varkar, was not someone who could simply be forgotten or dismissed. The outpost had given them shelter, but with it came a cost. The rebel leader, Roran, had been kind, but he hadn't let his guard down. There was still suspicion in his eyes, still a quiet doubt that lingered over the situation. Serafina knew this was inevitable. After revealing who she truly was, the balance had shifted. Now she was no longer just a fugitive. She was the princess of an empire, a symbol of everything the rebels despised. As Jake joined her by the wall, his expression was grim. He had been out speaking with the other rebels, trying to make some progress in their fight against the Empire. The war, which had raged on for years, was far from over. The Lorian Empire was a massive, unstoppable force, and no matter how much the rebels fought back, they always seemed to be one step behind. Now, with Serafina's presence among them, they had a chance, though a dangerous one. "You okay?" Jake asked quietly, his voice soft, but full of concern. Serafina nodded, though it was clear she wasn't truly fine. "Just thinking about everything. What happens now?" Her voice was low, more to herself than to him. Jake studied her closely. The once proud princess now looked smaller, vulnerable, like the weight of her own reality had taken a toll on her spirit. He couldn't imagine what it was like to be in her shoes, to have your life shattered by betrayal, to be exiled from everything you knew. It was hard enough surviving the desert, let alone facing the anchor of an entire empire. "I'm not sure," he replied. "But we'll figure it out. You're not alone in this." Serafina gave him a faint, appreciative smile, but didn't respond. She was grateful for Jake's support, but the truth was that there was no escaping her fate. She had tried to escape her father's shadow, to flee from the oppressive rule of King Varkar. But as long as she was his daughter, there was no running. The king's wrath would eventually find her, and when it did, the consequences would be unimaginable. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see a large transport truck rumbling toward the outpost. Dust swirled in the air as the vehicle came to a stop, its engines humming with power. The rebels quickly gathered, their weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the surroundings for any threats. Serafina's heart skipped a beat as she realized who had arrived. The back doors of the truck opened, and a group of soldiers emerged. Their uniforms were a familiar dark green, adorned with the insignia of the Lorian Empire. They were elite soldiers, highly trained and well-equipped, an unmistakable sign that King Varkar's wrath had already reached the desert. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. These were his finest, sent to hunt her down. The rebels stood their ground, weapons drawn. Roran stepped forward, his face hardening. He recognized the soldiers immediately. The Lorian Empire was ruthless, and the mere presence of these soldiers meant that things had just gotten real. Serafina stepped forward too, her heart racing. She had hoped to avoid this moment, but now it seemed like there was no way around it. "Leave now," Roran commanded, his voice firm and defiant. "You have no business here." The lead soldier, a tall man with a cold expression, didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the sand as he addressed Roran. "I don't think you understand. We're not here to negotiate." Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She knew this tone all too well. Her father's soldiers were never here to negotiate. They were here to destroy. Roran held his ground, though his face was grim. "You'll have to kill us all to get to her. If that's what you want, we'll give you a fight you won't forget." The soldier's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "We're not here to fight you. We're here for the princess." Serafina's heart dropped. There was no hiding from the king's wrath. The soldiers were not just here for her. They had come to destroy the rebels, to make an example of them. They were not just hunting a fugitive. They were sending a message. King Varkar had no mercy for those who defied him, and now the rebels were about to learn that lesson the hard way. "You'll never take her," Roran growled, his voice filled with determination. "We're ready to die before we let that happen." The soldier's smile faltered, and for a moment there was a tense silence. Serafina's mind raced. She knew that if they didn't act fast, the rebels would be wiped out. The Lorien Empire's forces were too powerful. But even as she felt the hopelessness creep in, she remembered something her mother had once told her. The king's wrath is terrible, but the strength of the people is greater. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let these people die for her. Not after everything they had done for her. She had to fight. As the battle raged on, Seraphina's thoughts turned inward. She remembered the day she had fled her father's palace, the day she had first set foot in the desert. She had been filled with fear then, terrified of the unknown. But now, standing on the front lines, she was filled with something else. Determination. She had found a new purpose here, among the rebels. She wasn't just the daughter of King Varkar anymore. She was a leader, a fighter. And she wasn't going to let her father's wrath destroy everything she had fought for. The sound of an explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending a shower of debris into the air. Seraphina's heart skipped a beat as she saw a group of rebel soldiers go down in a hail of gunfire. The Lorien soldiers were closing in, tightening their grip around the outpost. The odds were stacked against them, and every passing second felt like an eternity. "We can't hold them off much longer," Jake muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "We won't give up," Seraphina replied firmly, her gaze hardening. "We'll fight until the end." Her words were barely out of her mouth when a loud, shrill siren echoed across the battlefield. It was the unmistakable sound of the Lorien Empire's heavy artillery, a barrage of missiles launched from the sky, their explosive impact shaking the earth beneath them. The outpost's defenses were no match for the overwhelming firepower. Seraphina's heart skipped a beat as she saw the incoming missiles. She had seen the power of the Lorien artillery before. One direct hit could level the entire outpost in seconds. The rebels had no way of stopping them. "Get down," Jake shouted, pulling her to the ground just as the first missile exploded nearby, sending a wave of heat and debris across the battlefield. The world seemed to explode in a blinding flash of light. Seraphina's ears rang, and for a moment, she couldn't hear anything but the deafening roar of the blast. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body instinctively shielding itself from the force of the explosion. The ground beneath her shook violently, and she could feel the heat of the blast even through the sand and rubble. When the dust finally settled, Seraphina slowly opened her eyes. The world around her had changed. The once proud outpost was now a crumbled ruin. The rebels' positions had been shattered, and the Lorien soldiers were closing in. The sound of their footsteps was like the march of doom. Seraphina's mind raced. They were running out of time. The rebels had no way to stop the Lorien advance. There was only one choice left. She turned to Jake, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to end this. Now." Jake looked at her, his face set in a grim expression. "You're not suggesting we—" "I am," she interrupted. "We have one shot at this. If we don't take it, we lose everything." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He understood. There was no more running. This was their final stand. Seraphina stood up, her legs shaky from the blast, but her resolve unwavering. She drew her blaster, her fingers steady despite the chaos around her. "We fight together," she said, her voice low but fierce. Jake moved to her side, his own blaster aimed at the advancing Lorien soldiers. Together, they made their way toward the heart of the battlefield, where the Lorien forces were massing. As they moved, Seraphina could feel the weight of her decision settling over her. She knew this was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. If they could take down the Lorien commander, they could disrupt the entire chain of command. Without leadership, the Lorien soldiers might falter, might lose their will to fight. They pushed forward, their steps quick and determined. The rebel soldiers were fighting with everything they had left, but it was clear that the end was near. The Lorien forces were too strong. When they reached the heart of the enemy formation, Seraphina spotted the Lorien commander, a towering figure clad in gleaming armor, his face cold and impassive. He was standing at the center, overseeing the destruction of the rebels. Serafina didn't hesitate. She raised her blaster and took aim. The commander turned just in time to see her. There was a flash of recognition in his eyes, followed by a cold smirk. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Turning to Jake, her eyes burned with intensity. "We can't run. We have to fight back." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll do what we can. We don't have much time." Roran's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, he saw something in her, something powerful. She was no longer just a princess hiding from her father's wrath. She was a leader, someone who would do whatever it took to survive, to protect those who had helped her. The rebel soldiers began to position themselves, their faces grim, ready for the oncoming battle. The Lorien soldiers were not just soldiers, they were trained killers, each one an expert in combat. The odds were stacked against them, but Roran was not one to back down. The first shots rang out. The rebels fired their weapons, but the Lorien soldiers were already moving, their advanced armor absorbing the incoming fire. A brutal firefight broke out, dust and sand flying as the two sides clashed. Serafina fought alongside Jake, her heart pounding as she aimed and fired. Her father's soldiers were merciless, but she was determined to prove that the strength of the people was more powerful than the king's wrath. Every shot she fired, every movement she made, was a reminder that no matter how much the king tried to break her, she would never bow. As the battle raged on, Serafina's mind flashed back to her past. She remembered her father's cold, unforgiving eyes. She remembered the countless times she had tried to prove herself to him, only to be dismissed. But now, standing among the rebels, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The king's wrath might be powerful, but together they could overcome it. With a final, desperate push, the rebels fought back fiercely, determined to hold their ground. Serafina felt the weight of the battle settle over her, but she wasn't going to let it break her. She would fight, and she would win. For herself, for the rebels, and for everyone who had ever been crushed under the weight of King Varkar's rule. The battle raged on, a clash of metal and fury beneath the merciless desert sun. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid scent of burning fuel. The rebel outpost, once a symbol of hope, was now a battleground, with soldiers on both sides fighting fiercely to survive. Serafina moved through the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind focused on one thing: survival. She had come so far, fought so hard to escape her father's shadow. And now, with every passing second, it felt like the desert was swallowing her whole. But this wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about a princess who had been cast aside. This was about the future of the people who had taken her in, the rebels who had risked everything to fight against the oppressive empire that her father ruled. This was about the chance for a better world, a world where people weren't slaves to power and fear. Beside her, Jake was moving with lethal precision, his eyes scanning the battlefield, his every movement deliberate. The battle was chaotic, but he was a soldier at heart. There was no hesitation in him. His determination was unshakable, and as long as he was by Serafina's side, he would fight until his last breath. "Stay close," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Serafina nodded, her grip tight around her blaster. Her fingers ached, but she didn't let go. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The Lorien soldiers were relentless. Their advanced weaponry tore through the desert like a storm, their armor making them nearly invulnerable to the rebels' fire. But the rebels fought with a fierce desperation, knowing that this was their last stand. There was no retreat. There was no surrender. It was kill or be killed. Serafina ducked behind a shattered piece of cover, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart was hammering in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let fear take over. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. "How many more?" She called out to Jake, who was crouched beside her, his blaster raised. "Too many," he replied grimly, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "But we'll hold them off as long as we can." Serafina nodded. She knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The rebels were outnumbered, outgunned, and their resources were running out. But they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for a future free of the king's tyranny. "Matter what I do, it's always there. The betrayal, the lies, the war." Jake shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to forget it. You just need to stop letting it control you. You've fought so hard to get here, Serafina. Don't let your past define who you are now. You're more than your father's daughter. You're a leader. You've already proven that." Her heart swelled at his words, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else she needed to do, something she hadn't yet confronted. She had faced her enemies, fought in battles, but there was one battle left she had yet to fight, the battle with herself. "Do you think I can ever truly leave it behind?" she asked, her voice soft, almost fragile. "All the pain, the memories, will I ever be free of it?" Jake was quiet for a moment, as though weighing her question carefully. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with conviction. "You've already taken the first step. You've survived. You've fought for your freedom. The past doesn't get to define your future unless you let it. You have the power to choose who you want to be from here on out." Serafina nodded, her heart slowly beginning to unclench. He was right. The past was a part of her, but it didn't have to control her. She had already made the decision to fight for a better future, a future where she wasn't just the daughter of a tyrant, but a person in her own right. A leader, a warrior, someone who could build something new. "I don't know what's next," Serafina said, her voice steadier now. "But I'm ready to find out." Jake smiled, the expression warm and genuine. "And I'll be right here with you. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Serafina allowed herself to believe in that future. The past could no longer hold her captive. The desert had been a place of pain and betrayal, but it had also been a place of transformation. Here, in the ruins of everything she had once known, she had found a new path, a path where she could leave the past behind and step forward into a new life, one filled with hope and possibility. As they turned to walk away from the battlefield, Serafina's heart felt lighter, her steps more confident. She had faced her demons, and now, with Jake by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. She was no longer the princess abandoned in the desert. She was a warrior, a leader, a woman who had fought for her freedom and had found the strength to move forward. The desert behind her was still vast and endless, but now it was not a place of exile. It was a place of new beginnings. And as Serafina took the first steps into that future, she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape.